Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Amy Jaffe, and I am the co-chair of the Women in Energy Steering Committee here at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. I'm also the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment and the Director of Energy Security and the Climate Change Program at the Council of Foreign Relations. Today, we're going to talk about the impact of US LNG on Russian natural gas export policy. We have a set of very distinguished experts, and I will introduce them in a moment. Growing supplies of liquid natural gas from the United States and other countries have had dramatic implications for global gas markets, especially around pricing and flexibility of delivery. In particular, the changes underway have important implications for traditional dominant players like Russia, one of the top suppliers of gas to Europe. Today, we will discuss how Russian monopoly firm Gazprom will respond to rising competition of new LNG producers. Let me quickly say about our format today, like all of the events at the center, we are being webcast live, both with full video and a podcast recording will be available on our website and on iTunes in coming days. And for those of you watching online, as well as people here in the audience, you can ask a question for the panelists at any time using the hashtag CGEP events or our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy. I'm pleased to announce our panelists today. We will begin with a presentation by Dr. Tatiana Mitrova. She is a fellow here at the Center for Global Energy Policy and 20 years experience writing about and commenting with very high accuracy on the global and Russian energy markets. Her research covers production, transportation, demand, energy policy, pricing, and market restructuring. She serves as director of SKOLKOVO Energy Centre in Moscow. She will be joined after her prepared remarks by Dr. Timothy Frye, who is the Marshall D. Shulman Professor for Post-Soviet Foreign Policy here at the Columbia's Political Science Department. Dr. Frye specializes in a wide range of topics, but is one of the premier scholars working on public opinion polling in Russia, so has some very interesting insights to contribute today. And our final panelist is Ira Joseph, who is a fellow here at the Center for Global Energy Policy. In his full-time capacity, he manages PIRA's European Energy Service, which includes distinct services on European natural gas, European electricity, and he also is a leader in PIRA's Global LNG Service. Ira is co-author of PIRA's 2013 liquefied Henry Hub study, as well as the 2007 globalization of gas study. So without further ado, I am going to ask Tatiana to come up and begin her presentation.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for this introduction, and thanks to everybody for coming here in the morning. So I'm really very pleased and very happy to be here and to share with you some thoughts which are actually in a 50-page publication which is ready to be published. But it will be very interesting to get your feedback, your ideas. So please feel free to ask questions. I really want to make it more interactive and to have you involved, because actually, the topic we are going to discuss today, it's fascinating. So how I think you all heard analysts talking about price war between Russian gas, US LNG. That was the hottest topic for the last, 3-4 years. I believe the probability of the price war is not that big, frankly, but I am absolutely convinced that everything that has happened with the US LNG during the last, let's say, 5-7 years, it has tremendously affected the Russian gas export policy. And I would say it has affected impacted it to the better. So that was very constructive, and that was very helpful and positive, both for the Russian gas export strategy and for the global gas market development. So just a few words of introduction. So just look at these graphs. Actually, US and Soviet, then Russian gas production was very close. So you see they were competing for number one in the gas output for many years. And just recently, US took over. So it is now number one in terms of gas output. While in terms of exports, that was completely different. So Russia was player number one in the global gas trade, primarily pipeline gas. And only recently you can see this spike in the US gas exports. So they've never actually, being the largest gas producers, they never until recently have faced any direct competition. So we are now entering an absolutely new phase in the global gas market environment, when suddenly, instead of one dominant player, we have two really very influential, very flexible, very big players coming to the market. And of course it will have consequences for the market itself. Actually, until recently, the impact of the US LNG on the Russian gas export strategy was more, how to say, it was a bit theoretical. So the influence was there, definitely, but it was not a direct competition of the US and Russian gas molecules. It was more anticipation and expectation that US LNG will come to the market. And this expectation, this psychological factor itself, has made a lot in transforming the global gas environment and Russian gas export strategy. So first of all, the first example was the huge Stockman project, which Russia was carrying on, and the stakes were really high. The project was supposed to produce up to 75 million tons of LNG, one project, so you can imagine. And it was all targeted at the US market. But then shale revolution happened and the US became self-sufficient in gas. So the project, which is quite expensive and technologically challenging, it was stopped. But the other things started to happen, beginning from 2009, when there was a major downturn in the global economic activity and European gas demand went down. Actually, these expectations that soon there will be more LNG available on the market forced Gazprom to start to revise its contracts. The customers were absolutely unhappy with the oil indexation, so they were pressuring on Gazprom, requiring contractual revisions to go for hybrid pricing, to reduce take-or-pay obligations, and some other things, to remove destination clauses. So Gazprom had to go for that because first, it tried to resist in Europe. It tried to protect its old-fashioned way of making business and selling gas, and it began to lose market share. From 2009 till 2013, its share dropped from 30% down to 23%, which was quite sensitive, I would say. And more importantly, it has created a huge pressure on Gazprom domestically. So a lot of criticism on this inertial, slow, inefficient marketing in Europe. A lot of criticism, of course, coming from Novatek and Rosneft, which are major Gazprom's competitors on the domestic market. They do not have export access, while Gazprom does. So, of course, they felt jealous and they were criticizing Gazprom quite strongly. So Gazprom had to go for contractual revisions. During this period from 2009 till 2015, it has actually revised at least 3 times all its long-term contracts, providing at least 25% price discount and reducing the take-or-pay obligation. So there was a huge work done. There were very interesting and sophisticated schemes of pricing implemented, like these retroactive payments when the customers were paying for gas at oil linkage, but then at the end of the year compensated for the part of the gap between hub price and long-term oil-linked price. So there were very interesting ideas, but anyway, they were bringing Gazprom's pricing more closer to the market pricing, to the hub pricing. And right now, I would say in Europe, there is no single oil indexed contract left. They are all hybrid with a different share of spot pricing in the formula. But I would say Gazprom seems to be monitoring very closely this development and this gap between hub prices and oil and their long-term contractual prices, trying not to allow this gap to become too big so that it would undermine its competitive position. The other outcome of the US LNG expectations was that Russia speeded up several of its pipeline projects. So it was like, oh, Americans are going to target this market, so we have to secure our position. We need to be flexible. We might have to compete on price, so we need to have spare capacity in order to provide more additional gas. And I believe, so that was the case in Europe, I believe that partially that was one of the arguments for speeding up power of Siberia going to China. So it's not only the European market where this idea that we cannot relax, we cannot just sit and wait, because otherwise there will be competing gas coming from the US and conquering the market which we are regarding as our natural market. I've mentioned already domestic pressure on Gazprom, which also had a very interesting consequence, which is Russian LNG development. So basically since 2009, when the first LNG project was commissioned in Sakhalin, Russia is in the club of LNG producers, but then there was a very long pause. So nothing was happening. There were some projects, including Stockman, on the table. They were under discussion, but they were not proceeding. And Gazprom was always very slow, more focused on the pipeline business, not actually that keen and enthusiastic about going for LNG. So finally, this domestic pressure and this changing environment has incentivized Novatek to step in, and they've managed to convince the country's leadership that they can do it. They need some support, some tax breaks and help in the infrastructure development. They were provided all this stuff, and they've made a miracle, I would say. So building such sort of a project on time, on budget in Arctic, that was unbelievable. Frankly, no of the analysts thought that they will deliver, but they did. Actually, the second train was commissioned in August ahead of schedule, which is absolutely extraordinary. So they are doing a really good job, and they've announced in December very strong ambitions to expand this LNG production in Yamal and in Gedan. So the first project, which is Yamal LNG, it's 16 million tons, but they are now talking about going up to 80 million tons altogether. Arctic LNG 2, Arctic LNG 1, Arctic LNG 3. So there is a number of the further projects. They have secured the resource base, so they're working hard on the cost reduction, and yeah, so they've proved that they can manage such type of projects. So at the end of the day, what we have is that the very promise of the US LNG has already made Russian export policy more diversified. It brings in these competing players like Novatek. It made Gazprom, it forced Gazprom actually to become more flexible, more market-oriented, because otherwise it was losing the market. And once again, before even the first cargo from Sabine Pass reached Europe or Asia. So that is really a very unique situation, and let's take a look how it could evolve in the future. So actually, the European gas market, I will mainly focus in Europe because this is probably the main battlefield if we are talking about this competition. It consists of two segments, long-term contracts and spot supplies. And Gazprom has actually secured an amazing, very strong portfolio of long-term contracts. So you see these minimal contractual quantities, this gray area, minimal contractual quantities of the Russian pipeline gas. That's a lot, and they are beginning to expire post-2030, so most of these contracts are really lasting going forward. And you see that basically the market niche, which is not contracted, it's rather tiny. So the real room for competition, for a normal competition, because the customers are obliged to offtake this gas, these minimal contractual quantities, take-or-pay quantities from the long-term contracts. These contracts are very, very well protected. So we made a special study looking at the legal issues and whether they could be terminated. No way. So they are designed so that they are there to stay. There could be different changes in terms of pricing. There could be adjustment in terms of this level of take-or-pay volume. It go down from 80% to 75, 50%. So that's possible, but the contract will stay there. And that means that basically this very room for competition is very much limited. So Europe is locked in these long-term contracts, and it has no way out actually in the foreseeable future. And moreover, even for this part which is the competitive area, this market, this free market niche, Gazprom has a very good competitive position in terms of costs. So right now they are pricing their gas with some mixture of oil indexation and spot indexation, but actually their real costs are well below these price levels. And you see that even with the export duty, which is this light yellow area, $2.1 per MMBtu, so that's the state stake. Even with that, Gazprom's pipeline gas is extremely competitive. So maybe Nigerian LNG is cheaper and Qatarian LNG is also very competitive, but Russian gas seems to be extremely competitive both on the long run marginal cost basis, so if you look at the full cost, including investments, and if you look at the short run marginal cost basis, so avoiding let's forget sunk costs. Let's skip liquefaction costs because they are also long-term contracts, so forget about that. But that could be applied similarly to the transportation costs of Gazprom. So these pipelines have paid back for 3 or 4 times already. They are completely amortized. These are sunk costs. Actually, upstream investments in Yamal, for example, in Bovanenkovo, are also sunk costs already. So here again, Gazprom seems to be competitive when you are comparing apples to apples. It is quite clear. And moreover, I wanted to show you this graph that actually Gazprom has made a unique thing. It was strongly criticized for that, by the way. Domestically, in 2008, they've decided that, okay, we go for Bovanenkovo development. Bovanenkovo is the major field on Yamal Peninsula, which Soviet Union was looking at since 1980s and never actually stepping in because it is so huge and it is really in the middle of nowhere with the permafrost, with everything, any construction, everything needs to be brought from the continent. So it's really very unpleasant environment. So exactly in 2008, right before the oil prices dropped down, Gazprom made a historical investment decision. We go for Yamal. And that was above $100 billion. So, I mean, the whole project, including all infrastructure development, it's something tremendous. Gazprom went for this. Oil prices collapsed, so these investments became a real pain, but once they began already, they couldn't stop. They had to deliver that. So in 2013-14, they began the first production. Now they are building it up. I believe last year it was approximately 80 billion cubic meters. On plateau, this field alone, Bovanenkovo is able to produce 130 BCM. So that's huge. It's like comparable to all Russian gas exports to Europe. And it's more than Norway is producing, just one field. Can you imagine? But what is most interesting, just look at this graph, that even assuming all these investments, assuming that Gazprom, so, you know, there is a discussion that oil companies are not investing enough right now, and that we are going to face a deficit of oil and gas because the investments were cut. And so whether they will start invest right now or not, Gazprom has invested in 2008. And it is the first, basically, among the global oil and gas companies which is already in the next investment cycle. So all these investments can be regarded already as sunk investments. They are made. They are already approaching the plateau production, which will be there for like 30 years. So the reserves are really very, very big. And look at the costs. What happened with the costs of this new gas? So it is Gazprom's average cost. It is old gas, new gas, all together. So there was a spike in the cost in 2013, 2014, but then due to the ruble devaluation, actually they went down. And right now we can say that on average, Gazprom's gas, its upstream part, so it is production and all the taxes that are applicable, they are below $1 per MMBTU. And this slightly less than $1 per MMBTU is there to stay for, let's say, like 20 years. So Gazprom has secured that amazingly cheap resource base for a very long period of time to come. And in terms of its strategy, I'm quoting here Elena Burmistrova, who is CEO of Gazprom Export, and I think it says very clearly, we need our market share, and once again, the bets are very high. Gazprom cannot allow to use market share again, because then it will be facing very severe criticism domestically from Rosneft and Novatek, requiring to lift export monopoly because Gazprom is misperforming. So they have to keep this market share even if the prices are going lower. They are not interested in expanding this market share for a very simple reason. They understand that European customers and antitrust regulation will not allow them to do that. Everybody is complaining about too much being dependent on Russian gas. So 1/3 seems to be like a mutually acceptable target, and they will try to keep with it. By the way, last year it was 34%, so they've slightly exceeded this because of the price environment. I will come to that on the next slide. So, summing up, what is happening in Europe and what is the strategy? Basically, I cannot say that there is one strategy. There are different strategies depending on the market situation. And in this respect, Gazprom is very reactive. It's not proactive, actually. It is it's opportunistic behavior. It's trying to adjust to the market. So until recently, we were in this upper left corner with low oil prices and high Asian demand, where basically Gazprom didn't have to do anything. So all LNG was going to Asia. Gazprom's contractual prices, which are linked to cheap oil, were really very competitive. They were below TTF. So all the customers were absolutely happy to offtake Gazprom's gas. Therefore, the last 2 years, Gazprom was demonstrating record export volumes in Europe. So this year, it seems to be something about 200 billion cubic meters. So that includes actually former exports to Ukraine, which are now going to Europe and then as reverse flows going back to Ukraine. So there are some statistical tricks. But basically, anyway, Russia's gas exports to Europe in this part of the matrix are increasing without, once again, any additional marketing efforts. But that doesn't last for a long time. So we see already that we are moving to the upper right corner with higher oil prices, and the gap between Gazprom's prices and TTF prices, hub prices, is increasing. So here, once again, Gazprom will have to start these contractual revisions, price adjustments, some providing some discounts. So there will be increasing competition as the margin in Europe in this case is becoming bigger. But it seems that Gazprom is prepared, is well prepared, and has already enough experience to adjust in this situation as well. The really bad and difficult situation starts when we go to the lower side of the matrix. What if Asian demand slows down? That could happen because we know that Asian demand right now is driven primarily by China. That means by the Chinese, by the political decisions of the Chinese leadership. So the last winter, this decision to switch from coal to gas in the heating sector, that was the major driver of this amazing LNG demand growth. But will it be consistent with the higher oil prices? I'm not that sure. So that could happen, not even mentioning trade wars, economic slowdown, and other unpleasant stories. If oil prices are low, this is very similar to the upper right corner. So Gazprom will have to adjust, providing more price discounts, being more flexible, voluntarily decreasing contractual prices, but that's all manageable. But the real problem begins in the lower right corner, and that is exactly the part of the matrix where we could see a price war for a period of time, because you see this combination of high oil price and weak Asian demand is unlikely to last for a long time, but that could be a period of the cycle, 1 year, 2 years, when actually there will be not sufficient demand growth in Asia and all LNG will go to Europe. And the stakes are high, the prices are high, so the margins are very attractive, so the companies will really fight for this market by providing price discounts, going for price dampening. As I've shown, Gazprom has a very big room for price discounts, so it could easily go to $3.5 per BTU, as it did already in 2015, 2016, just due to the lower oil prices. It is very close to their break-even, but theoretically they could go even below that just to protect market share, not to allow competitors to conquer the market. So you see that it is all very liquid, it is all very fluent, but what is interesting, once again, it is about market competition, it is about price adjustments. It is actually illustrating that for the first time in the history, gas market is becoming truly global. So it's not just European domestic issues that drive it, it's really much more globalized, which is good, I believe. And it is actually, it is providing some hopes that due to the increasing competition and variety and diversification of both supply sources and demand, there will be the gas market will become more oil-like, and the customers will step by step quit this perception that gas is a politicized fuel. So if you have a choice, it's not that important. And actually, the case of Lithuania has demonstrated it quite well when the guys built FSRU and started to import LNG from the US. They've obtained much better price from Gazprom. Gazprom had to reduce its price for approximately 30%. They are still buying some LNG from the US on the seasonal basis. It's not a big part of their consumption. They are still mainly reliant on Gazprom's pipeline gas, which is cheaper, but they know that they have this choice, and if something goes wrong, if Gazprom starts to execute its market power, they can switch to LNG. So that is really providing confidence for the customers, and that is expanding potentially market for gas, which is competing now with coal, with renewables. So it is not like demand for gas is not granted. So this more liquid, more profound market for gas, I think is very positive outcome from this competition, and this market competition, that's something we should welcome. So there are some takeaways on the Gazprom strategy in Europe, but actually what I wanted to say to finalize my presentation is that if there are markets ruling, if it is like a fair competition between the largest producers with huge resource base, with huge transportation infrastructure, with this entrepreneurial spirit and looking for different creative solutions, that's perfect. But what is the danger? If it is actually, if the US will apply the same methodology which Russia was applying to its gas exports, making it a political tool. So when you are not saying, here is my gas, it's the best price, here are my conditions, so flexibility and take-or-pay volumes, destinations, and so on. If you are not competing in this market environment, but if you are going to say that this gas is good, this gas is bad, this is a gas of liberty, and this is gas of, totalitarianism, then it will actually move us to this vicious circle, to this security spiral. And unfortunately, I have an impression that that's exactly what we are observing during the last, let's say, half a year. I think that is very destructive for the gas market itself, because I saw already like Japanese customers, German customers saying, oh my God, so we had Russia exercising this gas weapon. Now we have the US pressuring on us that we have to buy the US LNG because it is good. So okay, we would better go for renewables, because that's too politically sensitive, dangerous, and who knows how these big guys will solve the geopolitical issues. So I'll stop on that, and yeah, I would be happy to discuss further all your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, for those watching online and listening to the podcast, my name is Amy Jaffe, and we are here with Dr. Tatiana Mitrova, Director of the SKOLKOVO Energy Centre in Moscow and a CGEP Fellow, Dr. Timothy Frye, Chair of the Department of Political Science and Marshall Shulman Professor of Post-Soviet Politics at Columbia University, and Ira Joseph, CGEP Fellow and Global Head of Gas and Power Analytics for S&P Global Platts. We are discussing the impact of US LNG on Russian natural gas export policy. We will have a conversation amongst the panelists and then open it up to questions from the audience in a little bit. For those here in person, if you have a question, raise your hand and we will bring a microphone to you at your seat. For those watching online, again, you can use the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy to ask a question. So I'm going to start our discussion by asking the panelists a few questions. Tatiana, my first question is something that you didn't mention specifically in your talk. So the LNG market is going to be quite flexible. You're going to have players that will pivot between Europe and the Pacific market based on price trends. Do you see Yamal LNG making those same kind of pivots, or do you think they will specifically focus on the Pacific market?
Thank you. That's a really good question. Well, look, they would love to do that, but there is a limitation which is called Northern Sea Route. So they cannot go to Arctic through this route to Pacific 12 months per year. Actually, right now it's open for 4-6 months maximum. They are working hard together with Rosatomflot, with the nuclear icebreakers, to make it open for 9 months, but that is requiring nuclear icebreakers going back and forth and keeping this route open. Anyway, there will be some gas going to Europe, some LNG going to Asia. They have contracts both with the European customers, with the Chinese, with the Japanese customers. So I think it will be quite flexible. And basically, you've seen already that this market can bring very big surprises in terms of where exactly the LNG is heading. So you remember this Yamal LNG, actually, which was resold 3 or 5 times and ended up in Boston last winter. So, and that's normal. I mean, if you remove politics from that, that is perfect. That's exactly how the liquid market should work.
Okay, well, I have a follow-up question of a similar nature for you, Ira. In the long run, are you expecting Europe to focus specifically more on Russian pipeline gas because of the price considerations that Tatiana mentioned? Or do you think there will be a greater emphasis on LNG in the long run?
Well, I think it'll be a combination of both. I mean, Europe, well, demand isn't necessarily going to grow in Europe. When you saw Tatiana's slide, it was like it may grow a little, it may drop a little, but more or less, demand, the long-term outlook for demand. So you're just talking about replacing existing supply in the market. So reduced Dutch supply, reduced UK supply, and by mid-next decade, probably reduced Norwegian supply. And so there'll be a combination of both. There'll be more Russian gas, pipeline gas, and there'll be more LNG. Now, the question, of course, becomes, will the LNG come from the US, or will it come from Nigeria, Algeria, Trinidad, somewhere else in the Atlantic Basin? The answer is that it will come from, you know, all of those places. And the price competitiveness of US LNG relative to other LNG players is as important as its price competitiveness against Russian gas. So it'll be a combination of all those things in terms of, can't really say growth, but in terms of supply replacement of this sort of traditional suppliers to the market.
All right, Dr. Frye, now I'm going to go to the political context of this. Tatiana raised a very interesting idea that in Europe, the best way out of the box is to go more forcefully for renewable energy. So my question for you is, in light of that context, that Europe's obviously perceiving a strong rivalry between the United States and Russia in energy, how do you think that new rivalry, because we've never had an energy rivalry between two major powers that had a larger footprint. We've seen a Venezuelan-Saudi rivalry. We've seen an Iranian-Saudi rivalry. We've seen an Iraqi-Saudi rivalry. But this would be the first time we had two superpowers in an energy rivalry. How do you think it'll affect the U.S.-Russia relationship?
Great question, because what's novel is not just the rivalries that you described, but the U.S. and Russia don't really compete economically on any fronts, and historically have not. So in this way, it is very much a novel situation. And my sense is, to the extent that the global gas market is truly becoming global and truly becoming a market, it's harder for politicians to politicize these issues. And they still can, of course, and the extent to which this issue becomes politicized will not depend so much, I think, on the energy market as it will on other issues. So when there's conflict over geopolitical issues, then you will see incentives on both sides to politicize the gas issue as one where we're directly competing with the other side and we need to get ahead because we're rivals. However, if the relationship improves, then I don't think, you would see this being a real cleavage between the U.S. and Russia, to the extent that this is a global market and they're both big players, but, there are other players as well. There are renewables, there are other, 10 or 20 years ago, then I think the scenario of this really being a big wedge issue would have been a lot more lively. With the liberalization and the technological investments and all the changes that we've seen, I think the incentives for that go down. So it'll be a hostage to politics, but not on this market, but probably on other issues.
So Ira, a follow-up question for you, as we've talked about this sort of increasingly competitive LNG market. There's some questions about what is the number at which U.S. LNG competes, because if you start taking the Henry Hub price and adding shipping costs to it, and then you build in a return on investment on LNG, the United States looks pretty uncompetitive. But can you foresee any scenarios where, as Tatiana mentioned, the United States gas would go down to, look away from its sunk costs? We're going to have basically waste gas in the associated fashion in Texas and some other locations where the shadow price will be essentially zero or possibly negative. How do you think that will affect the competitiveness of U.S. LNG pricing if we had a slower market?
Well, it does. I mean, the distinction between Henry Hub prices and U.S. gas prices is really the important one there. Because you have a situation where most of the decisions about being made about higher U.S. gas production are predicated on oil prices and oil production, because we have an inverted relationship now in the future, at least in North America, between oil production and gas production and oil prices and gas prices. The higher oil prices are, the more gas that's going to kick off, and the more gas that kicks off, the more bearish that is for gas prices. I mean, right now as it stands, even in West Texas, I mean, gas is only contributing, in a wet gas field, it's only contributing maybe 5 or 6% of the total revenue of the well, and we're going to get down to something like 2 or 3% or even lower than that. So it's really, again, about oil. And so the issue is sort of, where do we start from? The first generation of big U.S. LNG exports from the U.S. Gulf Coast were priced at a premium to Henry Hub. The next generation, I would imagine, should probably not be priced that way. That would seem to be a little too high of a price to start from. You basically want to look at a Waha price, which is the West Texas hub, plus transport to the U.S. Gulf Coast as kind of your starting point in the price. And that price should be below Henry Hub, which of course makes U.S. LNG exports more competitive because you're starting with a lower, commodity price. You start with a lower commodity price, the delivered price to anywhere you go in the world, even Northwest Europe or even farther east into Germany, Poland, or Lithuania, you're going to get a much more competitive price. As Tatiana pointed out, the price for Russian gas can go very, very low on a cost basis. And while Russia historically has never, ever competed on price, they have never been sort of aggressive price hawks in the market. If the market got too low, they pulled gas off the market, and that supported price. And I would imagine that would be a strategy that they would turn to in the future as well, in terms of flowing gas into the market. But the U.S. second generation projects, yes, on a long run marginal cost basis, I think are highly competitive. But so are the Qatari expansions, so are some of the Russian expansions, and these are sort of the three sort of building blocks, I think, of where we're going to go in terms of LNG production in the future.
So, Tatiana, the Russians face sort of, as we look out into the future, face sort of some very interesting trade-offs. You mentioned the Gazprom's desire to, hold a fixed market share in Europe, and as Ira's discussing, that could mean at a much lower price than they might be imagining today in their minds. And that leaves a sort of a conundrum for the Kremlin, which is, what matters the most? Your schematic of the high price oil price scenario and the low oil price scenario, and a high price oil scenario bringing a much more competitive market possibly for gas. I mean, if those circumstances come to be, is the emphasis still going to be on oil revenue and a higher oil price overall because if it's important to the economy, or will the geopolitical importance of natural gas be a factor weighing in?
That's a perfect question. So in 2009, facing this increasing competition, Gazprom and the government, by the way, decided that they go for price maximization strategy. So they cut supplies to the market, well, basically the demand is Europe. It is price elastic, but not that price elastic. So if you reduce prices 2 times, you do not get twice larger demand at all. Yeah, there will be a slight increase, maybe 5-7%. So basically, from the purely economic point of view, that was the right strategy. But they've lost market share in Europe. They were, as I said, Gazprom got severely criticized domestically. And so if you look at it not from the economic point of view, but from the stakeholder management point of view, you see that they won't be willing to repeat this experience. They will try to avoid it, even though the revenues will drop down probably, but they will keep their position, and the Russian state will keep this dominant position in Europe, which is extremely important from the geopolitical point of view. And actually, if you compare oil revenues and gas revenues for their importance for the budget, oil is providing approximately like 43-45% of the total federal budget revenues. Gas is responsible for 5 to 7%. So it's far lower. So of course we are talking about billions of dollars, but still it's not comparable with the importance of, let's say, OPEC Plus agreement.
Okay, I'm going to throw a curveball here. Now, we've talked a little bit about the importance of China's demand for the LNG market. Ira, I've heard you talk in other forums about China's broader role in the energy market. So not just as a consumer, but as an exporter of renewable energy technology. Could you elaborate on that? I mean, do Russia and the United States have to worry about China as an energy export rival?
Yeah, well, this also ties into Russia too, Amy, because, you know, I'd be interested in what Tatiana thinks about this too, but I think sort of the day that renewables took off was the first cutoff between Russia and Ukraine. And was it 06? New Year's Eve, I think it was? Had to go to work that day. So that really started to set off the renewables trend within Europe, which has now become global. And the Chinese government and Chinese panel manufacturers really sort of embrace that, and that's kind of where we've gotten to a place today where we've almost had a fully complete switch from a world where gas, which is originally when the European gas market was expanding, was competing with oil, to a world where gas has to be competitively priced against renewables. But now we've even gone past that, where gas really at the margin is going to have to compete with battery storage. So that was a really sort of important changing point in sort of the evolution of the market and the decarbonization of the market to some extent as well. So as Amy and I have talked about, you can't really just look at China as an importer of energy, and that's their importance. They are a producer of energy. They produce panels. And that's a very important way to look at the market in the future, because every year they're producing in capacity of panels like the equivalent of like German power demand. I mean, we're talking a lot of panels, and wherever they go, they affect the growth of European gas demand. They affect the growth of all gas demand, because no longer you have to consider like renewables the baseload supply for power going forward. And so you're going from a world where gas 10 years ago was like, oh, well, 90% of gas demand was going to come from power generation. It was going to be baseload 24 hours a day, to now renewables is half of power generation growth around the world in our forecast going forward, half of it in terms of capacity. And now the gas portion, which is a large component of that other 50% of the growth, is only really fighting over now for like 4 to 7 hours a day and not 24 hours a day. So it got hit twice. It got hit baseload, and then it got hit, and then it got hit on the number of hours a day, but then an underlying aggregate growth. So I think in terms of Russia, if they could go back in a time machine to 2006 and would have realized that this one thing would have caused all of this to happen in less than a little over a decade now, I think maybe there would have been some different thinking on it.
So Tatiana, let me let you respond. I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, and also for Russia's path forward, given the fact that Russia's got deep financial obligations to China. Are they perceived as an energy competitor, and how do you see that evolving in the relationship going forward?
So I think that's a fascinating topic. So I mean, the energy transition and the role of Russian hydrocarbons, not only gas but also oil in the future, that's the biggest question mark. And I would say it seems that Russian government begins to realize that the demand is not granted. And actually, all these transformations in Europe with the European gas demand, they were very illustrative, because if you look, so first of all, energy demand is not rising in many countries. Look at the UK, look at France. They are actually, their total primary energy demand is going down. Their electricity demand is going down, which is even more surprising. So these are mature economies with very good energy efficiency. So basically the market, which has been growing for like 50 years, suddenly it stops to grow. And then we look at this competition between gas, coal, and renewables. I wouldn't actually drop out coal, because it is dirty, but it's very competitive. It's very cheap, and still it performs quite well in Germany, in Poland, in China, of course. So that's a strong competitor. And then if you look at the different ways how gas could improve its position, when gas is priced at, let's say, $4 per BTU, as it was in 2015, 2016, we saw many gas-fired power plants going to the full load, and the spark spread is very attractive, so that's fine. But when gas goes back to $8 per BTU, as it is happening right now, then its position is far less secure. And moreover, if we imagine introduction of the CO2 price, which was actually made in the UK, first you see that gas is very fast in squeezing off coal, that happens, but then the next year you see that gas is being squeezed from the market by renewables, because differently from renewables, Gazprom still has CO2 content, so it's not that competitive. So it's a very complicated mixture, and the question, it's really the question for the whole gas industry, what is it going to propose in this whole energy transition, except for saying that gas is bridge fuel, which doesn't sound that convincing any longer. So it has to prove why it is transition fuel. When you have batteries, which are becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and which can provide these backup capacities for which gas was always presented as like a necessary part of energy transition, then it's not that straightforward. So I believe that gas industry has to do a very strong job on looking for green gas, looking for biomethane, looking for hydrogen. So there is some way how to survive in the decarbonizing world, but it is connected to a lot of innovations and cost reductions, so there should be a competitive value proposition which is not there in place. And therefore, you've mentioned this graph with the European gas demand. Actually, my personal belief is that it will go down. Yeah. And as Amy, you said, the logical move of the European politicians, which are looking at the US and Russia exercising their power in the gas market, is, okay, we will go for renewables, and that's basically what they have just announced. So they've set the new targets to reach 32% of renewable electricity by 2030, which is like a day after tomorrow, which means that they have either to close, I mean, we've made calculations, they have either to close all the coal-fired power plants, so you can imagine what that means, or they have to close half of gas-fired power plants. So it could have very strong consequences for the whole global gas market. And as for China, there is really, it is very complicated relationship between Russia and China, and Russia has been always very cautious in dealing with China. It feels still quite disappointed during the last few years when the sanctions were introduced that China actually didn't help with the capital. It was like staying as an observer, not actually going into the projects, or going only in those projects where it can get really good equity share, as it was with Novatek. So Russia is not looking at its own domestic market as a big playing field. So with cheap hydrocarbons, it's not going to be a big customer on renewables. But when comparing different scenarios for India, for China itself, for Europe, for the non-OECD Asia, Southeast Asia, actually these cheaper and cheaper solutions, especially solar solutions accompanied with the batteries, they are becoming a very disturbing factor, and they are all produced in China, basically. So it is a real competition forthcoming, but at the same time, for Russia as a hydrocarbon exporter, China is now becoming the major point of growth. So European market will not grow. That's clear. China can absorb a lot of additional oil, a lot of additional gas, so it is a very important client. So here, Russia will have to navigate in this very turbulent environment, trying to build up relations with the best client, but at the same time to compete on the other markets.
Very, very interesting discussion. So I'm going to switch gears for 1 minute because with the subject of sanctions was mentioned, I'm going to ask one last question to Dr. Frye, and then we'll go to you, the audience, with questions. Dr. Frye, how do the average Russians feel about sanctions? Are they working? Is the United States, when it comes to the polling in Russia, is the U.S. strategy on sanctions an effective one?
Great, so thanks a lot. Yeah, I've done some research on this, and Russia is a great subject for studying public attitudes towards sanctions, because sanctions usually get levied on Iran, North Korea, Sudan, not places where you can do great public opinion research, right? Russia, by contrast, has a very well-developed public opinion research, and people are generally willing to answer lots of normal kinds of questions we ask. So there's a claim out there that the sanctions have had a rally around the flag effect and allowed President Putin to keep his ratings up. And my research hasn't shown that at all. It's shown that the boost that President Putin has had over the last 4 years, although it's come down recently, is primarily due to the annexation of Crimea and has very little to do with U.S. sanctions towards Russia. So the interesting part, though, is that since 1992, one of the best predictors of support for first President Yeltsin and then for President Putin is the underlying state of the economy. Russians react the same way people react in other countries. The state of the economy has a big impact on how they view the government. So, and from my research, I found that's still the case. If you remind Russians about the fairly dismal economic performance since 2012, their support for the government and for President Putin goes down. And that's true across the board. People who support Putin, people who are more skeptical, they all reduce their support. But they don't make the next step in saying that, the sanctions are behind this. They blame corruption. They blame inefficiencies in Russian policy. They blame lots of things. But they don't see the sanctions having a direct impact on them because supposedly the sanctions are targeted. They're hitting these particular oligarchs. So in a way, the sanctions are having an effect on support for the Russian government in a very indirect way by slowing down economic growth. Most estimates suggest that the sanctions are contributing to around a 1%, cutting off about 1% of Russian economic growth. And this is in an economy that's growing only by about 1% a year. So that's a fairly substantial number. But we don't see any evidence of a rally around the flag due to sanctions. Now, if this next round of sanctions, the sanctions from hell, were to have a much more visible impact, we might see that shift. But we'll have to wait and see, what happens with that.
Okay, well, let me open up to the audience. We have a question, active question right up here in the first row. Go ahead. Get the microphone. And please speak into the microphone because for our podcast listeners and our web listeners.
Thank you very much. Gabriel Avgerinos, Energy Mentors, formerly Poten and Partners LNG. I have a two-pronged question, one which is medium term and one which is longer term. For the medium term, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the competitive strategy of Russia versus Qatar, because both of them are really in the same bailiwick of expansions and existing assets and amortized. The one difference that I'd like you to address is competition of dry gas LNG economics versus wet gas LNG economics, which are positive and negative depending on what oil prices are doing. And of course, the fact that you have joint ventures with Western European and Asian companies in Qatar versus we remain to see what's happening in Russia. The longer term question is exactly what Ira talked about, which I agree very much with, which is China to be looked at not only as an importer, but as an exporter, especially for renewables. In addition to solar panels, they're also number one in wind turbines. And if you combine their longer term plan, which is already in implementation stages right now, the Global Energy Interconnector domestically, it says that something like about 2025 to 2030, you might be seeing China really spreading its renewable energy producer, supplier, exporter throughout Asia, which means limiting the potential for Russia or Qatar or others to export LNG. And combine that with the fact that you will probably by that time have more shale gas available in other countries than the US, and therefore diminishing the requirement for LNG imports. Thank you.
Thank you. Great questions. So first on competition with Qatar. Actually, in my paper, that's exactly what I am saying, that we should not look that much on the competition between Russian pipeline gas and US LNG, but rather at their competition with Qatar, which is far more competitive and having much better economics. So indeed, competition with Qatar was very painful during the previous cycle. In 2009, 2011, it was Qatari gas, Qatari LNG taking over Gazprom's market share in Europe. So it looks that the next cycle, it is promising to be a bit different, so there will be more players on the market. We have Qatar, Australia, US, and Russia, so that's a more interesting set. Qatar historically likes to go to Asia, so they have long-term contracts and they move additional supplies to Europe only if Asian market is not able to absorb it, because Asian market has premium normally. So, but it could well be that if Asian market goes slower, that we will see more Qatari LNG in Europe, especially assuming their plans on expansion. So going up to 110 million tons, which they've announced recently. But at the same time, look, this moratorium on dealing with Qatar, this whole geopolitical situation in the region, it definitely doesn't help. There was just recently an amazing news that Novatek has sold its latest LNG carrier. I think was it Abu Dhabi? Yeah. So it is actually, it's a natural market for Qatar, but for the political reasons, it has to bring it from Arctic. I mean, there could be some political obstacles on the way of Qatar, but basically, if we remove politics, Qatar is the better positioned LNG producer in the world, especially due to these wet gas economics. So actually the gas that they are liquefying is coming as a zero cost byproduct of producing natural gas liquids. But I would say Novatek in this respect has very similar economics. So Novatek is actually, it has always been known inside Russia, not even that much as gas producer, but as condensate producer. So it is very strong in natural gas liquids, and it knows how to monetize them differently from Gazprom, by the way. So natural gas liquids in their economics in Yamal LNG and in the further projects also play a very important role. So now going to your second question about long-term competitiveness of Russian hydrocarbons and demand for these hydrocarbons. I am responsible for the Global and Russian Energy Outlook, which we are producing every year. So that's a major exercise between SKOLKOVO and Academy of Sciences, absolutely independent. We are not paid for it. It's just our own interest to try to look how the markets will evolve. And since 2013, our main message is, look guys, Russian hydrocarbon exports will not increase dramatically. There could be some additional incremental growth, but much slower, not like 50% as it was in the first decade of this century. It is exhausted, the potential, it is exhausted. The role of hydrocarbon revenues in the GDP, federal budget, investments, everything, it will halve by 2040. So there will be, this sector is no longer able to be long-term driver of the economic growth for the country. That's absolutely clear, and it's both. It's unconventionals, it is, Brazilian offshore, Ghana. So there are many new oil producers, there are many new gas producers. There is strong pressure from renewables and electricity storage, and energy efficiency is playing a tremendous role in limiting oil demand, by the way. So there are many factors which all together are actually narrowing this niche for Russian hydrocarbons. So therefore, what we are trying to deliver to the Russian leadership, that we have to change the model because it will not work for a long time.
Okay, I'm going to take
Can I-
our, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up and see what's the response when you tell people that. One gets,
Initially,
we had late socialist period, everyone knew what the problems were, and nobody did anything. It's not an uncommon problem, so.
So the first reaction in 2013, 2014 was very negative. So they thought that we are like foreign agents or something like that. But then I would say we managed to change the perception. So they're saying, okay, yeah, we see that it will become more difficult. The margins will shrink. The volumes will not grow as much as we hoped. So we need to become much more efficient. We need to look for new market niches. And by the way, LNG is regarded exactly as the new market niche compared to the pipeline gas. Looking at hydrogen, looking at renewables, actually, during the last 2 years, Russia has made a very big step in developing renewables domestically, and the public perception has changed. So historically, it was like a toy for rich nations. That was the attitude. Now more and more people, and especially students, I would say, so the younger generation, they are all crazy about renewables, and there are big investments. So they are now building 5 gigawatt of renewable capacities in Russia. So I think that finally the common sense will have victory in this battle, but it takes time to change people's perception, and in this respect, popularization and education plays a very significant role.
Okay, I'm going to take one last question, which I'm taking from our online listeners. Online question from Twitter about the role of changing currency on the accounting basis in the new contracts with Europe, whether that's going to the euro or to some kind of Asian foreign exchange. Do you think the recent strength in the dollar or U.S. sanctions will change any of the calculation on this currency aspect?
Currency aspect is extremely important, and I apologize that I didn't mention it during my presentation, because it was actually falling ruble rate, exchange rate, which allowed Russia to become so competitive both in gas and in oil, and actually in coal. The recent years were the record coal exports, because costs are mainly nominated in rubles. So when your currency halves, then you are really becoming extremely competitive. At the same time, all the financial sanctions and problems with making deals in dollars, they are really becoming more and more visible. So there is actually a strategy. I don't know how profound and well calculated it is. I haven't seen it because it was made secret. On moving on de-dollarization, as it's called, so moving to trading in euros, in yuan, in any other, in rubles actually, any other currencies. Well, I don't think that trading in rubles is very attractive for the customers given its unstable exchange rate. But euros, for me, seem to be absolutely reasonable choice. If you are selling oil and gas to Europe, why the hell you nominate it in dollars? So that makes sense, and I'm sure that there will be some steps and there will be probably new financial instruments. And actually, there is some promising development at St. Petersburg Mercantile Exchange. So they have oil trading, they have gas trading. It is very limited. It is very, so far, quite artificial exercise. But theoretically, if it is more opened up, if there is a bit more liberalization of this trade, that could become a good platform in dealing with the foreign customers in their currencies. So I think there will be some way forward in this respect.
Very interesting. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. As I mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on the CGEP website in a few days. You can also subscribe to our podcast series on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and other platforms. This has been one of a number of great events we've been hosting in the coming weeks. Upcoming events include the IEA's, very timely in light of our conversation, Renewable Energy Market Report 2018. The speaker will be Amy Bahar, Renewable Energy Markets Analyst at the International Energy Agency, and he was the project manager for the report. That will be on October 26th from 9:30 a.m. to 11 a.m. Here at SEPA in room 1501. And then a second event, IEA's Gas 2018 Medium-Term Report and Global Gas Security Review. The speaker will be John Batiste Dubriel, Senior Natural Gas Analyst at the IEA, on October 30th, 6 to 7:30 p.m. at Wool Hall in the East Gallery. We hope to see you again soon, and please join me in thanking our speakers one last time.